Hello and welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast. If you'd like to become a patron of the podcast, then just pop along to patreon.com/the History Network and sign up to be a patron there. Thanks to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, season 34, episode 9. Eyewitness to War, Ammianus Marcellinus and the Siege of Amida, AD 359, Part 1. This episode was written by Murray Darm. Murray is an ancient and medieval military historian from New Zealand living in Australia. He has written more than 100 articles on various aspects of ancient and medieval military history, as well as other historical topics from all periods, ranging from the history of opera to the runic alphabet and recipients of the Victoria Cross. He is the author of Macedonian Phalangite versus Persian Warrior, Athenian Hoplite versus Spartan Hoplite, and Leuctra 371 BC, all from Osprey Publishing. He is a regular on the Ancient Warfare podcast, as well as a regular writer for us here. In the summer of AD 359, the armies of the Sasanian Persian Shahanshah, King of Kings, Shapur II, reign 309 to 379, invaded the Roman East. This invasion was the long-cherished revenge for a humiliating peace imposed on the Persians by the Romans 60 years earlier. The Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus was an eyewitness to the most dramatic events of this new war, serving in the army of the Emperor Constantius II, reign 337 to 361, as a protector domesticus, a guard cavalryman. His Res Gestae, Roman history, at this point is full of precise detail and evocative description. No action is more dramatic than the Siege of Amida. Made king at birth in 309, Shapur reached his maturity in 325, and as soon as he made war against the Arab tribes of northern Syria and then invaded the Arabian Peninsula, reaching Medina. Sasanian Persia was in a long rebuilding and consolidation phase after the humiliation and loss of vast tracts of territory due to the Peace of Nisibis. Due to the Peace of Nisibis made in 299 after Galerius had utterly defeated Narses, reign 293 to 303, Shapur's grandfather. Shapur was then determined to wage war against the Romans because of the ongoing humiliation of the peace. Rome also supported the claim to the throne of his older brother Hormizd, who had been imprisoned on his father's death in 309 but had escaped in 323 or 324 and fled to the Roman court of Constantine at Constantinople, where he was treated with great respect. Shapur first invaded Roman territory in 337, just before the death of Constantine I, reign 306 to 337, and those campaigns continued until 350. No surviving source covers this period in any detail. We are merely told of 9 battles being fought. One battle was at Singara in the mid-340s, and Nisibis was put under siege 3 times, in 338, circa 346 and 350, but each time it held. Without taking that important city, Shapur's invasions could progress no further. Shapur had to break off hostilities against Rome in 350 because of raids into Sasanian territory in the east. A treaty was agreed with Constantius. Shapur's wars with these eastern raiders, probably Kidderite Huns called Chionites or Zionites, led by their king Grumbates, lasted until 358, after which we find Grambates fighting as an ally alongside Shapur against Rome. The next war with Rome began soon after in 358 and would last until 363. In 359, Shapur invaded southern Armenia. He immediately encountered resistance at the fortified frontier city of Amida, modern Diyarbakir, southeastern Turkey. The city was on a high plateau on the southern bank of the Tigris River. It would need to be taken if his advance was to progress. This bold summation gets us far ahead of our story, however. Rome's eastern armies were commanded by the Magister Equitum per Orientem Ursicinus, in whose service the future historian Ammianus was. Ammianus had been a protectores domestici under Ursicinus in 353 at Nisibis, and the historian remains loyal to his commander despite providing evidence of intrigues against Ursicinus at court. In Ammianus, he is innocent of any wrongdoing. Ursicinus was, in fact, second in command under the Magister Peditum per Orientem Sabinianus, a lazy and profligate man, inappropriate for so important a command, at least according to Ammianus. Learning of the invasion, Ursicinus made haste to Nisibis, probably expecting another siege of that vital city. A line of fires on the horizon showed that the enemy had crossed the Tigris and were plundering more than usual. Ursicinus and his men, including Ammianus, therefore hastened forward towards Mount Isla. They continued their march by night and avoided detection by roving Sasanian patrols, reaching a cold spring. From there they made their way as quickly as possible to Amida. Finding a note written in cipher left for them, they learned that the Persians had crossed the Anzabar, the modern Great Zab, and Tigris rivers. Ammianus was then sent on a personal scouting mission, accompanied only by a trusted centurion to observe Persian movements. This mission implies both immense trust in Ammianus and previous experience of the area. On the third day, Ammianus saw the land to the horizon filled with innumerable troops, with the king leading the way, glittering in splendid attire. With Shapur were various allies. Ammianus claims all this detail could be seen from the cliff top, unless one's eyesight was impaired. On Shapur's left was his erstwhile enemy Grambates, described as a king of the Chionite. On the right was the king of Albani, that is Caucasian Albania, which is now Georgia and Azerbaijan, of equal rank and honour. These were followed by various leaders prominent in reputation and rank, followed by a multitude of every degree, chosen from the flower of the neighbouring nations and taught to endure hardship by long-continued training. This alliance of peoples is important to bear in mind for some of the details Ammianus later furnishes us with. This multitude passed the ruins of Nineveh within modern Mosul, Iraq, and a sacrifice was made in the middle of the river An-Asba on the bridge of boats which had been constructed to transport the army across. Ammianus made his way back to Ursicinus, and riders were sent to several commanders, Cassianus, the Dux Mesopotamiae, and Euphronius, the rector, deputy governor of the province. Carrhae was abandoned because it had weak fortifications, and a scorched earth policy was enacted to rob the invading army of fodder for their cavalry. Not a green thing was to be seen. Sabinianus, however, remained inactive despite the threat. Meanwhile, the invading army now bypassed Nisibis, perhaps wary of its impregnability on the three previous occasions Shapur had besieged it. Learning that the Euphrates was in flood, The Persians unexpectedly turned their march to the right, northwestwards, meaning they marched into areas which had not been burnt of their supplies. Ursicinus discovered this through scouts, and therefore planned to destroy the bridges over the Euphrates at Zeugma, modern Belkis, Turkey, and Capasana, north of Zeugma and under the waters of the modern Gaziantep Dam. Unfortunately, a force of 700 Illyrian cavalry, who were meant to be guarding the road, withdrew from it for protection during the night, and 20,000 men of the Sasanian army took the opportunity to advance past their position, hiding close to Amida. As Ursicinus approached Amida himself, the glinting of the Sasanian weapons gave away the location of this force. Ursicinus prepared to engage them. The Romans got the worst of the engagement, however, and scattered. Some were driven to the banks of the Tigris, which they attempted to cross, others fought the enemy pursuing them, and others sought the safety of the slopes of the Taurus mountains. This last group included Ursicinus himself, who was saved by the speed of his horse. He only escaped with a single groom and a tribune. Ammianus had taken a different route, however, towards Amida itself, but barely escaped capture. With a wounded fellow domesticus protector, he moved at speed towards the city, some distance higher up the escarpment, and which was accessible only by a single narrow and steep path. They had to fight the pursuing Persians every step of the way, and came under concentrated fire from the walls, which did not differentiate friend from foe, forcing them all to seek shelter together. There, as enemies sought shelter in the same restricted spot, fighting ceased. As it is on several occasions throughout the siege, Ammianus' description is visceral. Here, mingled with the Persians, who were rushing to the higher ground with the same effort as ourselves, we remained motionless until sunrise of the next day, so crowded together that the bodies of the slain, held upright by the throng, could nowhere find room to fall, and that in front of me a soldier with his head cut in two and split in equal halves by a powerful sword stroke was so pressed on all sides that he stood erect like a stump. And although showers of weapons from all kinds of artillery flew from the battlements, nevertheless the nearness of the walls saved us from that danger, and when I at last entered the city by a postern gate, I found it crowded, since a throng of both sexes had flocked to it from the neighbouring countryside. The city of Amida had had its defences strengthened by Constantius when he was Caesar between AD 324 and 337. This was, according to Ammianus, so that its neighbours could have a secure place of refuge, just as it now provided. The city was surrounded by a strong wall with towers and contained an armory. The south side of the city was next to the Tigris, and in the centre of the city was a spring with drinkable water. It was as good a place as any to withstand a siege. Ammianus tells us that the original garrison of Amida consisted of the 5th Legion, Parthica, together with a force of no mean size of natives, probably meaning a force of auxiliaries. Now, however, 6 additional legions, having outstripped the advancing horde of Persians by rapid marches, were drawn up upon its very strong walls. These were the soldiers of Magnentius and Decentius, whom, after finishing the campaigns of the civil wars, the emperor had forced, as being untrustworthy and turbulent, to come to the Orient, where none but foreign wars are to be feared. Also the soldiers of the 30th and the 10th, also called Fortenses, strong, and the Superventores and Paventores with Aelianus, who was then a count. Later, Ammianus will tell us the city contained 120,000 people, in all far more than its normal size, and a crowd which had dire consequences. Well, thanks, Murray, again for writing that excellent episode for us. If you would like to write an episode for us, just drop us a line, info@thehistorynetwork.org. And please do go along to patreon.com/thehistorynetwork and become a patron there. Thanks again to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. You've been listening to the historynetwork.org podcast, written by Murray Darm, read by Nick Barker.